Hello everyone, and welcome to the International Business Law Podcast series. I'm your professor, Glenn Torres-Spelliscy. Thanks for joining me. In this chapter, we tell the story of trade. A trade is the backbone of all business, including international businesses, and as a result, it is hard to imagine a world without it. It's also hard to recognize, because trade is embedded deep in the economic order. So trade plays this central, but often unacknowledged role in our lives. Look around the room that you are sitting in, the various electronic devices, your clothes, raw materials, technology, furniture. The majority of these things, including their component parts, are manufactured in various countries around the globe and are in your possession solely because of trade. Now, that is not to say that the practice of international trade is without controversy. Because trade is about maximizing the market's efficiency, it can effectively destroy certain domestic industries and send them elsewhere. We only have to look at the modern US manufacturing sector to get a sense of the effects of trade. And the reality is that the US economy is no longer well situated to be a mass production society. The churning out of simple consumer goods can be done much more cost effectively in other places around the world. The US does, however, maintain a competitive advantage with respect to many other industries, including the production of complex technology and the financial sector, among others. So although trade can admittedly have some negative effects, most modern theorists and governments now view regulated trade through a positive lens. Now, what do I mean by that, regulated trade? Well, every country is trying to find a balance between allowing the amount of trade that is most beneficial to its economy, while at the same time offering some protections for its domestic market and producers. Countries do this through a series of tariff and non-tariff barriers. Now, tariffs are essentially a tax levied on the goods at the moment of importation. Now, importantly, the tax is paid by the importer, not the exporter. Countries can also erect non-tariff barriers to trade, such as labeling requirements or safety regulations that make it more difficult for imports to enter the country. Now, as we will discuss in the course of our studies, much of the international trade regime has developed to regulate the use of these tariff and non-tariff barriers. Now let's begin with a little history. The belief in the benefits of trade liberalization grew in the years following the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, many states had adopted protectionist policies, closing their borders to trade and imposing tariffs and duties to protect domestic industry. The US Congress passed a bill imposing tariffs on over 900 products. And despite calls from economists to veto the bill, President Hoover did not. And the result was an escalating tariff war among developed nations, as everyone sought to try to isolate themselves from the effects of the Depression. But soon most countries realized that protectionism was ineffective policy and likely made the Depression worse. Indeed, there was a growing recognition among leading economies that trade could be beneficial to domestic markets, that by opening up markets, a state could benefit from the competitive advantages that it had, whether that was labor, resources, capital, etc. So following the conclusion of World War II, the international community embarked on an aggressive policy of trade liberalization. But as we learned in the Great Depression, when you open up markets, you need to build corresponding regulatory systems. While unregulated markets can be profitable, they are extremely risky. And without oversight, transparency, and regulation, participants in the markets do not have reliable expectations as to how trading partners are likely to perform. And that instability stands in the way of development. So the international community sought to create a regime that would allow trading partners to have reliable expectations when they entered foreign markets. The construction of the regime began at the end of World War II. It was a Bretton Woods agreement where the concept of an international trading organization was first debated.
Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort. Zhang Shi-kung, one of China's representatives, with Secretary and Mrs. Henry Morgenthau. United States Treasury Secretary Morgenthau heads the American delegation. On the opening day, in his role of acting conference president, he addresses the meeting. To be discussed are plans for the stabilization of world currencies. All agreements must be ratified by the governing bodies of the nations involved before becoming effective. Delegates to this monetary and financial conference pose on the hotel lawn. These meetings are designed to promote trade in the post-war world and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
The result was the negotiation of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, known as GATT, in 1947. The rules negotiated under GATT came to govern almost all of the world's trade for the better part of 50 years. GATT's rules laid the foundation for the liberalization of the trade regime by limiting the tariffs that could be charged, forbidding discrimination between the goods of member states, and requiring transparency. First, GATT provided that only customs tariffs, import taxes equal to domestic production taxes, anti-dumping and countervailing duties, as well as administration fees could be charged to imported goods. That was a limitation. Second, GATT adopted the principle of non-discrimination, which had two consequences. States agreed to grant most favored nation status to all contracting states, meaning that if a GATT member nation set a favorable tariff rate on a particular type of good for one member, the same tariff had to be applied to all other GATT nations. Second, it meant that goods from other GATT members had to be afforded quote-unquote national treatment, meaning that the foreign goods had to be treated as domestic goods once they were in the domestic market. So tariffs could be charged when the goods entered the country, but as soon as they were inside the domestic market, they had to be treated just as if they had originated domestically. Now, those principles were largely adopted by the successor organization at GATT, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. You see, between 1947 and 1994, GATT had undergone a series of multilateral trade negotiations, known as rounds, devoted to both tariff and non-tariff matters. These rounds usually lasted multiple years, and they culminated in the Uruguay round with the 1994 establishment of the World Trade Organization. It's an intergovernmental umbrella organization, and it's actually a series of annexes that contain multiple agreements. There are multilateral agreements that are binding on all members relating to trade rules. There's a dispute settlement mechanism. There's some trade policy review mechanisms. And there are, of course, exceptions written into some of the WTO rules. For example, there are various concessions that can be made with respect to imports and exports from developing countries, as well as free trade areas that can be established, or customs unions like the EU or the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. There are also national security exceptions which allow states to violate the rules, preferably temporarily, in order to protect a significant national interest. Now, much like you can sell goods that you make across borders, you can also sell services across borders. And this is particularly true in the modern age, where computers allow us to sell our services all over the world without ever leaving our office or our home. And the trade and services becoming a growing part of the global economy. The General Agreement on the Trade and Services, or GATT, is the primary regulatory regime for the trade and services. It works through the imposition of two primary core principles: the granting of most favored nation treatment to all member states, similar to GATT, and transparency. So the first status requires that each member state grant services and service suppliers from other member states treatment no less favorable than it accords to like services and suppliers of any other country, similar to the GATT principle. In other words, all members of the WTO must be treated similarly. Transparency requires that member states publish the rules and regulations relating to the trade and services sector in a way that's easily accessible. Again, the idea is that it's through transparency that enforcement becomes possible. Now, in addition to those general obligations, GATT also allows states to submit a schedule of specific commitments, where they agree to open up specific sectors of their service economy to international trade, But this is done on a sector-by-sector basis and is voluntary, so the commitments vary between the states. With the movement of services across borders, there is also a corresponding need to provide some type of international regulation of the labor market, which brings us to the topic of the International Labour Organization, a specialized agency of the United Nations responsible for promoting international efforts to improve working conditions, living standards, and the equitable treatment of workers. In addition to the international regime, there are a number of regional and national regimes that regulate the trade of services as well. We'll look at this area by looking at the European Union, one of the most complicated and integrated regional economic groupings that has ever been constructed, and its detailed rules on the free movement of labor and services across the borders. So we have a lot of ground to cover this week. That's it for the podcast. Go on to read the text and the other readings, and I will see you on the discussion boards.